Welcome to Global Ethics Review. I'm Alex Woodson from Carnegie Council, the world's catalyst for ethical action. In this podcast series, we'll be connecting Carnegie Council's work and current events with our senior fellows, senior staff, and friends of our organization. You'll hear from leading experts on artificial intelligence and technology, migration, public health, and U.S. foreign policy and global engagement. For this episode on emerging technology and the war in Ukraine, I'm speaking with Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Arthur Holland Michel. He's the founder of the Center for the Study of the Drone at Bard College and was its co-director from 2012 to 2020. More recently, he served as a researcher on the Security and Technology team at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. He's the author of Eyes in the Sky, The Secret Rise of Gorgon's Stare and How It Will Watch Us All. In this podcast, Michel and I focus mostly on facial recognition systems and loitering munitions and drones in the context of Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine. These technologies are not necessarily new, but the way they're being used today, in the first major interstate war in Europe in decades, has been the subject of much discussion in the intelligence community. These systems have also played a major role in the narrative of this war, as it has been reported on in the mainstream press. Michel and I discussed some ethical questions around these technologies and put them into the context of some larger issues around the war. For more on Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you can listen to the most recent episode of our Doorstep podcast with guest Melinda Herring of the Atlantic Council. Michel has also done several other podcasts on ethics and emerging technology. For all of that and more, you can go to carnegiecouncil.org. For now, here's my talk with Arthur Holland Michel. Hey, Arthur Holland Michel, thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm glad we got to do this.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
So I just want to start with a general question. From your perspective, how is the war in Ukraine different when looking at emerging technology as compared to some recent wars, like the war in Libya, the war in Syria? We know this is the first interstate war in Europe in 70 years, but how is this different from a technology perspective in your view?
You know, things move so fast in the technology space that in a way every war is different. That being said, also every war is kind of the same in that they all abide by a certain set of what seem to be almost like inviolable natural laws of warfare that don't seem to change regardless of what technology is being used. But we can get into that a little bit later when we talk about specific technologies. I'd say that one of the most significant things about this conflict is exactly what you alluded to, the fact that this is the first war in a long time that is being fought by two significant, relatively advanced militaries engaging directly with each other instead of fighting by proxy. A lot of the technologies that are being deployed in this war have been deployed in previous conflicts, but in those cases, they were generally deployed by, a major power against a force that was much smaller, in an asymmetric sort of counter-insurgency style conflict, or by somewhat equivalent forces in a sort of proxy style war, as Libya being a good example of that. I guess another thing that's different is that there is a lot more public attention on this war than on other recent wars. And there has been, in particular, a lot of attention paid to the specific technologies that are being used. And that is significant because these technologies, as we'll see over and over the course of this conversation, I'd imagine, have a really compelling kind of media appeal to them. They draw a lot of attention. They spark interest, and that can actually have an effect on how the war as a whole is perceived.
Yeah, that's definitely something I'd like to touch on. I think one of the technologies that's really been highlighted in this war, and I saw it highlighted especially couple months ago when Russian forces were moving out of the Kyiv area back to Russia after that offensive somewhat stalled, and you started to hear about the war crimes that were conducted in Bucha and places like that, and facial recognition technology really became the subject of a lot of articles, a lot of focus. So is that something new in this war? Have we seen this in other wars? Is this a new, deciding which soldiers are to blame using facial recognition technology? Is that something that's unique to this war? And how has that evolved over the last few months as atrocities have become maybe more clearer as the war has changed?
So facial recognition technology in itself is not completely new. It has existed for a few years now. And during that time, there have been a number of conflicts involving pretty sophisticated military powers. So it might be a stretch to say that this is the first conflict where facial recognition is being used, or indeed is being used in this way. What again is different is that there has been a lot of media attention around the use of facial recognition, in part because some of the companies involved have actually wanted to promote the fact that their technology is being used in this war, as compared to other wars where the companies that are potentially providing these services probably had much less of an incentive to show off about what they were doing. Certainly some of these use cases that Ukraine has claimed to be deploying facial recognition for are not necessarily what people first expected facial recognition would be used for in conflict. Initially, a lot of the talk was about how it could be used to identify potential targets for attack. But in fact, what Ukraine claims to be doing is using it, as many have seen, to identify soldiers who've been killed or injured or captured. In some cases, to then use their information about their identities to contact their families directly. And as you said, to serve as a potential launch point for investigations into alleged crimes, be they war crimes or even cases, for example, of looting. And Ukraine has said that it has conducted, I think, as of about a month ago, almost 15,000 or 14,000 of these searches. What we have less data on is the actual results of these investigations. Very, very early in the war, they said that something like 580 families had been notified of the deaths of soldiers who are their relatives, but that's pretty outdated information. So it becomes a little bit of a black hole beyond those kind of top line numbers.
It's an interesting quote I saw in a Wired article from March, so it might be a little out of date. The CEO of Tactical Systems, a technology company, said the more these individuals, I assume he's talking about Russian soldiers, the more these individuals are publicly identified and know that the intelligence community is following their movements, the less chance they will commit war crimes. So I'm not sure. I mean, this is a bit of a shift in terms of the topic. I'm not sure if that's something that you can speak to. I'm not sure if anyone can really speak to it, but it's just an interesting thought that these soldiers are fighting now, knowing that they're out there, that their faces are out there and they can be identified. And then you hear talk about how morale is low among Russian troops as well. And I just wonder if these facial recognition systems, if this technology environment in Ukraine is having an effect on that level. And I'm not sure if there's any way to really
I mean, that's certainly part of the narrative that we hear time and time again. Indeed, the CEO of Clearview, which is the kind of most prominent company to offer facial recognition services to Ukraine, said something very similar in an interview with, I think, the Washington Post. Now, to be clear, this is not just something that we've heard as part of the narrative for facial recognition or other sort of emerging surveillance and intelligence technologies in warfare, but also in the law enforcement space. For a long time, people have claimed that, if the population knew that there was facial recognition technology or other surveillance technologies in their city, they would be less inclined to commit crimes. That is a claim that is not necessarily borne out by evidence. I mean, it would be a hard claim to prove in any kind of evidentiary way, even if there was some basis to it. But it also relies on a few pretty critical and pretty bold assumptions. One being that these alleged or potential war criminals or would-be war criminals would be aware that these technologies are in use. It also rests on the assumption that they believe that the technologies would be effective, which, as many people, especially people who fight in war and see the way emerging technologies often tend to break in warfare, they would probably have some pretty good reasons to believe that actually facial recognition and other similar technologies wouldn't be effective. And it also relies on the assumption that there would be consequences if they were caught, which is a big one in the case of a military organization that has certainly internally not shown any sort of instruments of accountability to apply to soldiers who've committed these types of crimes, and certainly in international community as well. That gets a little outside of the emerging technology conversation, narrowly defined, but it is important to think about those factors when assessing some of the claims about what any emerging technology can and cannot do in conflict. Certainly, if it doesn't have a track record, especially.
Yeah, I think for a lot of these questions, we have to wait until the end of the war, maybe, or when fighting has stopped a little bit to see what their effects are. I want to move on to some of the combat technologies, some of the technologies that we're actually seeing play out in these battles in Ukraine. So one term that I've seen that I wasn't super familiar with, or wasn't really familiar with at all up until a few weeks ago, is the term loitering munitions. We've previously talked about drones, lethal autonomous weapons, different types of technology related to that. So I was hoping you could explain exactly what loitering munitions is. I'm not sure that's a term that a lot of people are familiar with outside of the intelligence community and outside of the technology community. So what are loitering munitions and how are they being used in Ukraine?
A loitering munition is essentially a cross between a drone and a missile. It is a missile in the sense that it has an explosive warhead on it, and its function is to fly into a target and destroy that target. It is a drone in the sense that, unlike a missile, once it has been launched, it can loiter. That really is the key term. It can fly over the battle space, in some cases for quite a long time. And during this time, soldiers on the ground who have launched it can see what it is seeing through its camera. So they can assess the broader situation. They can perhaps use that time to actually find the target that they are looking for. They may be receiving fire on the ground. They know that target is coming from a general area, but they don't know exactly where it is. And so instead of firing a traditional missile into that general vicinity, they can fly the loitering munition overhead, find it, take the time to identify it, and then fly it into that object or that tank or that structure or that individual. They have existed for quite a long time. I'm talking, maybe decade and a half, maybe even longer if you talk about sort of prototypes. They have also been used in conflicts. They were used to an extent in the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, as an anti-tank weapon. And they're coming up in discussions about the war in Ukraine because the United States has said that it is supplying a limited number of loitering munitions to Ukraine, a loitering munition called the Switchblade. And there is also evidence that Russia has been using its own loitering munitions, again, to a fairly limited degree in operations on the ground.
So that brings me to my next question, which is about lethal autonomous weapons. And so I'm not as well versed in the subject as you, as a lot of people maybe listening to this podcast, or a lot of people that come through Carnegie Council. But I know that there might be some questions about the definition of a lethal autonomous weapons or killer robot. In a foreign policy article from May, it says lethal autonomous weapons are here. They mentioned a Russian system, maybe it's the same one that you're talking about, the Kalashnikov ZALA Arrow KUB BLA loitering munition. And then there's the Turkish-made Bayraktar drone. Not sure I'm pronouncing that right. So a lot of it probably just comes down to an individual's definitions or an organization's definitions. But do you consider these lethal autonomous weapons that are being used in Ukraine? And is this, you mentioned loitering munitions being used in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, but is the way loitering munitions and maybe lethal autonomous weapons being used now, is that different than what we've seen in the past in other conflicts?
So you're absolutely right that it all comes down to a question of how you define loitering munitions. All loitering munitions have some automated capability in the sense that you could, they have some guidance systems in them. In some cases, for example, the soldiers on the ground who are operating the system, they see the target in the video feed and they click on that target, and then the loitering munition autonomously guides itself into that target. That doesn't actually reach the threshold of a lethal autonomous weapon in the way that such weapons have been defined, for example, by the International Committee of the Red Cross, where to be a lethal autonomous weapon, the system really has to select and engage targets without human intervention. So it has to decide from a range of different options and choose a target or a set of targets and quote unquote decide whether or not to attack them, and b how to do so. So yes, the loitering munition in that sense wouldn't be autonomous. There have been some claims that that loitering munitions do have some autonomous capabilities that might reach the threshold of that definition. That there hasn't been any hard evidence of that, certainly not from actual real world uses. The uses that we have seen in Ukraine probably wouldn't necessitate anything that reaches the level of being a lethal autonomous weapon in the strict sense of the term. They're being used against the kinds of targets that they have been used against in previous wars. Tanks being a predominant one, radar sites. In the case of radar sites, the loitering munition can actually be guided towards the target on the basis of the target's radar emissions, so that makes it even in a way easier to guide the system to the target. But we haven't seen anything in the way of what would appear to be a loitering munition being given carte blanche to assess a range of different targets and to make a quote unquote decision as to whether to attack them. I should also note, just for the sake of our listeners, and this is something that you see a lot in the discourse, that other drones like the Bayraktar TB2 that you mentioned are sort of lumped in to this broader category of autonomous weapons, but that is actually inaccurate. The drones like the Bayraktar are remotely controlled. They do carry weapons, but these weapons are launched by human operators, and their autonomous capabilities are fairly minimal, which is not to say that they haven't been an influential weapon in the war, but it's a distinction that is important if you're trying to be precise about where we are technologically in warfare.
So we just recorded a podcast a couple hours ago with Melinda Herring from the Atlantic Council. She's speaking on the Doorstep podcast with our senior fellows, Nick Gvozdev and Tatiana Serafin, talking about, she gave a pretty grim assessment of the war, describing, we're in late June now, how Russia's just destroying large parts of eastern Ukraine, really trying to make it unlivable for Ukrainians. So kind of a two-part question here. As the war has shifted to just this war of attrition right now in the Donbass, which is what it looks like, how has the use of drones and some of these technologies changed? And does it really have, I'm talking about how Ukraine is using them, and what effect do these drones have, if any, or even facial recognition technology, some of these emerging technologies, if the strategy of Putin is just to destroy, apartment blocks in Ukraine, destroy infrastructure?
I mean, in a way, regardless of what Russia's strategy is, that the question still stands. What is the effect of these technologies on this war, or indeed on all wars? Because it's also important to consider how these technologies are changing war more broadly. I'm not being exactly an expert on this. I'm of the thinking to agree that yes, this war is going to drag on, that the assessment is a grim one. But in terms of technology itself, it's important to keep in mind what I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, which is the outsize attention that these technologies receive is not a reliable metric of the effect that they have on warfare. Drones and potentially autonomous loitering munitions, facial recognition, and other forms of artificial intelligence, they're exciting, they're interesting, they are they demand and receive attention in the way that other technologies, like say anti-tank weapons or plain old artillery, simply doesn't. And that gives that plays on the public's availability bias to think, well, okay, these TB2 Bayraktar drones are in the news all the time. That must mean that Ukraine is using them constantly and that they are shifting the course of the war. But that's actually not necessarily true. Indeed, Zelensky has said that the TB2 drone in particular shouldn't merit as much attention as it's getting. I mean, and not in as many words, but he got some question about the TB drone, and he effectively said, "Forget about the TB2 drone. That's not what matters, right?" And I would potentially go so far as to suggest that it's possible that one could reach a similar conclusion about these other technologies that we've talked about. That yes, they are being used. Yes, they are having some effect, but on balance, in terms of technologies that could really potentially shift the course of the war, they're not necessarily up there. I imagine, again, assuming that Ukraine continues to receive these technologies, that they will continue to be used regardless of how the war evolves. As the tactical contours of the conflict change, certainly different capabilities of different technologies become more or less valuable or important. But that I can't imagine, a scenario where Russia is still in Ukraine and any one of these technologies just stops being used completely. And indeed, that there was a fairly interesting development recently where it seems like Ukraine used a drone to attack an oil refinery inside Russia. It's not the first time that Ukraine has conducted an attack inside Russia, but it does seem to be one of the first times that it's done so with a drone. And that just gives a little window into, say, if the conflict were to evolve into more of like a standoff kind of conflict, that drones might potentially still play a role, but obviously in a different way that they're potentially playing now. So it's a little hard to predict the future, but I think it's this. Another thing actually I should add that is interesting. I just taught a class on emerging technology and conflict last week at the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. And one of the things that the students very quickly came to realize is that the adversary always has a response to the use of any emerging technology. There is no emerging technology in recent memory where the adversary, upon seeing it, has sort of thrown up their hands and said, "Oh, okay, well, this is just a new reality for us, and we're not going to do anything differently." So you can imagine, in the cases of all of the technologies that we've talked about, the other side has taken note and has sought to adjust its practices. Say in facial recognition, maybe Russian soldiers are using more face coverings. In the case of loitering munitions, maybe they're using jamming technology that can be used to potentially take these systems down out of the sky. They might take more care in hiding their positions because of the use of drones. And that obviously affects the balance of how effective these weapons are in warfare as well.
Definitely. And just one last aspect of drones that I wanted to mention is I'm not sure if this is all drones, but I know drones can take video footage as well. And so you can have footage of, let's say, Ukraine blowing up an oil refinery, and that can be used for propaganda purposes as well. And I think we saw that a lot at the start of the war. Drones were just being touted as this almost miracle for the military. I think that's shifted a bit, but it's just another interesting aspect of this technology.
It goes again to the narrative, right? Like the drones and other emerging technologies, especially in the case of drones, because they actually produce footage that then can be shared on social media, but also other technologies, they fit very well into this narrative of, challenging the adversary, changing the tide of the war. The Bayraktar drone, there was even a song made about it. There was an animal at the Kiev Zoo that was named after it. So, considering that narrative, that's not to say these technologies aren't important. It's not even to say that the narrative isn't important. That the narrative can have a really important effect on, on shaping perceptions of the war, on encouraging people, calling people to arms. It's all very useful for that. That can have tactical effects. But it is always important to put that asterisk next to emerging technologies when trying to really assess how they're affecting the war on the ground.
So last question, just another general question to end with. As this war drags on, what are you looking at specifically? What are some of the areas of research, within emerging technology, maybe other than we've spoken about today, are you looking at? And I think this has been a really tough this has been a tough podcast to research, just because there's so much information out there. You type drones into Twitter, into Google, and you get all these different sources. It's a bit overwhelming. So what are some sources that you would recommend to listeners of this podcast who really want to learn about these issues?
Yeah, certainly. In terms of technologies that I'll be thinking about, and I'm obviously going to continue to monitor all the technologies that we've talked about. One technology that has been already used extensively in the war and that will continue to play, I think, a pivotal role is open source intelligence. That is the investigation of incidents or of people based on information that is by and large freely available online through, for example, photos that are posted on social media. A lot of the attention on open source intelligence has been directed towards this very large online community of amateur intelligence analysts who do all of this work out in the open. They post and share and workshop their results and their findings on platforms like Twitter. But also open source intelligence is increasingly becoming an important tool for intelligence agencies. So you can be certain that whatever open source intelligence work is being done, for example, on Twitter, that there are parallel efforts in, for example, Western intelligence agencies, and the results of that are in some cases likely to be passed on to Ukraine. There has also been a lot of talk about the use of artificial intelligence, for example, for analyzing satellite imagery, of which there is a lot around the war in Ukraine. The use of artificial intelligence can potentially speed that process up and allow agencies to analyze more information. There are also other deployment possibilities for AI in realms of intelligence analysis. For example, infusing information in looking for patterns in big data. You can be certain that military, certainly Western intelligence agencies, are using some of those technologies and potentially passing the information on to Ukraine. But it could be, or it may be the case that it's already happened, that Ukraine is deploying some of this technology already, or maybe is accepting the help of Western countries. Now, the interesting thing about that is that unlike the other technologies that we've talked about today, we're not likely to get a lot of information about it because it's very, very secretive, and all users want to keep it that way. Now, in terms of tips on reliable sources, I think that the reliable media outlets have actually done a pretty good job so far. And there's been a lot of great coverage, for example, on the AP or on Reuters, and the Economist, which has an excellent defense editor who really has a sharp understanding of emerging technologies in conflict. But it's also valuable to go on Twitter and just to see what people are saying. That's not going to necessarily give you evidentiary information, but it's going to give you a sense of how the narrative is shaping up. And I think that is valuable too, because across the board, and again, this is a valuable lesson that I shared with my students, but also that my students last week reinforced back to me, is that you really have to do a lot of the analytical work yourself. Even if you're reading a story in the Times or the AP, you have to understand things that the reporters aren't necessarily going to talk about, things about how the adversary always has a countermeasure. The facts about how militaries, it's often in their interest to overhype or to feed into that narrative about these technologies and to downplay their potential drawbacks, and also just to deploy some common sense reasoning around things like physics and geometry, where if a drone, for example, is used with remote control connections to the operator, then that drone is not going to have more than at most a couple of 100 kilometers of range. So if you see claims that Ukraine could use drones to penetrate deep within Russian soil, and that those drones have radio control, you can just doing your own little bit of reasoning and your own little bit of sleuthing can actually see that that's not necessarily a credible claim, even though even the reporters themselves may want it to be true. So I think those tips are even more important perhaps than thinking about specific outlets that you might want to follow. And finally, I'd say just to not forget about the traditional tools of warfare that are still playing a major role. Things like artillery, small arms, rocket propelled grenades or anti-tank weapons. That stuff is really important too, and we shouldn't lose sight of it just because there are drones in the sky.
Thank you very much. That's all. That's some great advice. And just want to reiterate that we have the recent Doorstep podcast that's really about the more traditional aspects of this war and how that's going. So it's always good to keep that in mind. So Arthur Holland Michel, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
It's been great. Thanks, Alex.
That was Carnegie Council Senior Fellow Arthur Holland Michel. I'm Alex Woodson. Thanks for listening to Global Ethics Review, and stay safe and healthy.